In 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie stood at the rim of a canyon in the Texas Panhandle and looked down at something the United States Army had been searching for across 300 miles of open prairie. Rows of Comanche lodges lining the canyon floor for miles. Thousands of horses grazing the curing grass. An entire winter's worth of dried meat and pemmican stored and ready for the cold months ahead. What nobody knew at the time was that destroying what sat at the bottom of that canyon wouldn't just end a military campaign. It would dismantle a survival system that had kept an entire nation alive through winters that killed trained soldiers, froze cattle herds solid, and buried wagon trains under drifting walls of snow. This is how the Comanche survived the deadliest winters on the North American plains, and why the answer starts not on the prairie, but 1,000 miles away, in the mountains of Wyoming. It was the late 1600s, and the people who would become the Comanche were still part of the northern Shoshone, living near the upper reaches of the Platte River in what is now eastern Wyoming. They were mountain people. Small bands of hunters and gatherers moving through high country, following elk and bighorn sheep on foot, digging for roots and gathering seeds in the valleys between peaks. They didn't farm. They didn't build permanent villages. Their shelters were crude brush structures or skin-covered lean-tos, barely adequate for mountain winters. And in the broader landscape of North American tribal power, they were nobody. The Blackfoot dominated the northern plains. The Apache controlled the southern grasslands. The Shoshone bands that would become the Comanche were just another cluster of small groups, eking out survival in the high country, invisible to the larger forces reshaping the continent around them. But something was shifting to the south. Spanish colonists had brought horses into the American Southwest more than a century earlier. And after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when Pueblo Indians drove the Spanish out of New Mexico and seized their livestock, thousands of horses suddenly became available for trade. The Pueblo began moving them north through established trade networks. And somewhere in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, a group of Shoshone hunters acquired a handful of these animals. That single acquisition set off one of the most dramatic cultural transformations in North American history. These were people who had spent centuries on foot, chasing game through mountain passes, carrying their possessions on their backs or dragging them behind dogs. Within a single generation, they had taught themselves to ride, to breed selectively for speed and endurance, and to fight from horseback with a skill that stunned every European observer who encountered them. They pushed south through the Rockies and onto the southern Great Plains, chasing the massive bison herds that darkened the grasslands from horizon to horizon. They broke away from the Shoshone entirely, taking roughly 10,000 members with them, and began carving out territory that would eventually dwarf the homelands of every neighboring tribe. The speed of the transformation was staggering. By 1750, their population had swelled to around 15,000. By 1780, some estimates placed it as high as 40,000, fueled by abundant buffalo, captured members from rival tribes, and a steady stream of Shoshone who followed the breakaway group south. Their territory, known as Comancheria, stretched across 240,000 square miles of present-day Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. They called themselves Numunu, meaning simply the people. Their enemies called them Comanche, derived from a Ute word meaning anyone who wants to fight me all the time. That's not a typo, by the way. 240,000 square miles, larger than France. And they held it not with forts or walls or standing armies, but with horses, mobility, and a way of living so precisely fitted to the plains that the most brutal season on the grasslands, winter, became a period of relative safety rather than crisis. Understanding how that was possible means understanding what the southern plains actually do to living things in winter. And what they do is terrifying. The Texas Panhandle sits atop the Llano Estacado, a flat, featureless tableland of short grass prairie that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction. In summer, temperatures climb past 40 Celsius, and the ground bakes into hardpan. But in winter, the geography turns lethal. Arctic air pours south out of Canada with absolutely nothing to slow it down. There are no mountains, no forests, no hills of any consequence, just flat, open grassland, and wind. Temperatures on the caprock regularly drop to -20 Celsius and sometimes colder. Snow comes in horizontally, driven by gusts that strip the warmth out of anything caught in the open. European settlers and soldiers who tried to cross the Llano Estacado in winter learned these facts the hard way. Military expeditions that launched campaigns in cold weather lost men to frostbite and hypothermia within days of leaving their supply lines. Cattle froze, standing upright in fields, and ranchers who arrived in spring found entire herds dead where they had stood, coated in ice. Wagon trains that misjudged the timing of a norther. The sudden cold fronts that can drop temperatures by 20 or 30 degrees in a matter of hours found themselves stranded in whiteout conditions with no shelter, no firewood, and no way to see more than a few feet in any direction. The winter plains weren't simply cold. They were actively hostile to anything that didn't know how to use the land itself as protection. The Comanche lived through this, generation after generation, without permanent walls, without insulated buildings, without any of the technologies that European settlers considered essential. They carried everything they owned. They moved constantly. And they didn't just endure the winters, they used them. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The foundation of Comanche winter survival wasn't a tool or a technique. It was geography. When autumn arrived and the first cold winds began sweeping across the caprock, the Comanche bands that had spent summer scattered across the open plains following the buffalo herds began to move. They headed for the canyons. Palo Duro Canyon sits just south of present-day Amarillo, and the first time you see it, it doesn't make sense. You've been driving for hours across perfectly flat grassland, and then the ground opens up beneath you. A massive chasm of red rock cliffs, juniper-dotted mesas, layered sandstone walls striped orange and white, and a river winding along the bottom like a vein of water cut through solid stone. It's the second largest canyon in North America, stretching roughly 120 miles in length, with walls rising 800 feet above the canyon floor. Up on the caprock, the wind never stops and the cold is relentless. But inside the canyon, conditions are radically different. Those 800-foot walls act as a windbreak on a geological scale, blocking the northern gusts entirely. Temperatures on the canyon floor run noticeably warmer than on the exposed plains above. Water flows year-round from the Prairie Dogtown fork of the Red River. Juniper and mesquite trees line the slopes, providing fuel. And deer, elk, and antelope shelter in the canyon during winter too, providing fresh game even when the buffalo herds have moved. The Comanche established their winter camps along the canyon floor, arranging tipis in rows near water sources and against protected cliff faces. Blanco Canyon, east of present-day Lubbock, served as a secondary winter stronghold. The different bands that had roamed independently all summer would sometimes converge in these sheltered canyons, camping together and hunting together through the cold months. Palo Duro was considered a place of peace, secure from enemies up on the Llano Estacado, where the conditions kept hostile forces at bay as effectively as any fortress wall. If you're wondering how that's even possible, keeping thousands of people alive through months of freezing temperatures using nothing but animal hides and wooden poles, the answer is the teepee. And the Comanche teepee was not a primitive tent. It was a feat of portable engineering that solved problems modern shelter design still wrestles with. The Comanche used a 4-pole foundation when erecting their teepees, tying 4 poles together first as the base structure before leaning the remaining poles against them. This was different from many other plains tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne, who used a 3-pole foundation. The 4-pole system created a different profile at the top and produced a sturdier base for the 16 to 18 lodge poles that formed the full frame, each pole running 20 to 30 feet in length. Over this frame, women stretched the teepee cover, sewn together from approximately 14 tanned buffalo hides. But the cover was only the beginning. The real cold weather engineering was layered inside. An inner lining of additional hides or woven material hung from the poles, creating a gap between the outer wall and the interior. That air gap functioned exactly the way double-pane glass works in a modern window. Cold air hitting the exterior wall lost its energy before it could reach the living space. Warm air from the central fire pit, built directly beneath the smoke hole at the apex, was trapped between the two layers and radiated back into the room. The shape itself was deliberate. Comanche teepees were not symmetrical. The back wall was steeper than the front, angling into the prevailing winds and deflecting gusts upward and over the structure, rather than allowing them to push against a flat surface. The doorway faced east, toward the morning sun and away from the dominant western winds. This meant the first light of day entered the lodge directly, warming the interior at dawn, while the cold wind hit the reinforced back wall instead of the entrance. Smoke flaps at the top could be adjusted using exterior poles, allowing the occupants to control ventilation without opening the door. Pull them one way, and the smoke drew upward and out. Shift them another way, and you could reduce airflow to hold more heat inside. The whole system was adjustable, responsive, and it worked in conditions that would have collapsed a European campaign tent in hours. Beds of buffalo robes laid over dried grass and hay lined the outer edges of the interior, arranged in a circle around the fire pit. Colorful willow backrests propped against the lodge poles gave people a place to sit upright during the day. Some larger lodges even used bison hide partitions to create separate areas within the single room, giving families a degree of privacy. When the fire alone wasn't enough to push back the cold, the Comanche heated stones in the flames until they were almost too hot to touch, then placed them around the living space, where they radiated steady warmth for hours through the night. An entire family of 8 to 10 people could sleep, cook, eat, and wait out blizzards inside a single teepee, the smoke curling up through the flap overhead, the fire crackling at the center, the layered hides keeping the wind out and the warmth in. And the most remarkable part? An experienced Comanche woman could disassemble the entire structure, roll the cover, lash the poles into a horse-drawn travois, and have her family moving within minutes. When the camp needed to relocate to follow game or avoid danger, an entire village of hundreds of people could be packed up and on the move in under an hour. The poles themselves did double duty as the travois frame, so nothing was wasted and nothing was left behind. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The Tipi design, the canyon geography, the horse herds grazing the canyon floor, everything working together in a system that had run without failure for generations. That didn't last, but shelter alone doesn't carry a people through a 5-month winter. You need calories, and you need them preserved and stored before the first blizzard shuts down the hunt. This was the second pillar of Comanche winter survival, and it ran through one animal. The buffalo was the Comanche's entire material economy, compressed into a single species. They consumed approximately 6.5 bison per person per year for food, shelter, and clothing alone. Across the nation and its allies, that meant roughly 175,000 buffalo killed annually just for subsistence. And they used every single part. The meat was food, roasted fresh over open fires or slow-dried for storage. The hides became tipi covers, blankets, bedding, shields, and containers. Bones were shaped into scrapers, awls, needles, and war clubs. Sinew was pulled into thread for sewing and string for bows. The stomachs were cleaned and used as cooking vessels and water bags. Hooves were boiled down into glue. Even the dried dung, buffalo chips, served as fuel on the treeless plains where wood was scarce. For winter food stores, the Comanche relied on pemmican, and pemmican was less a recipe than a survival technology. Women sliced buffalo meat into thin strips and dried it in the sun or over slow fires until every trace of moisture was gone. Then they pounded the dried meat into powder using stone mallets, mixed it with rendered buffalo fat, and folded in dried berries, crushed nuts, and sometimes bone marrow. The mixture was pressed into compact cakes or packed tightly into rawhide bags called parfleches. The result was a lightweight, calorie-dense food that could last for months, possibly years, without spoiling. A single buffalo could yield roughly 100 pounds of pemmican. The fat acted as both a binding agent and a preservative, sealing the dried meat and berries away from moisture and air. Fur traders who encountered Comanche pemmican described it as a concentrated, slightly sweet provision. dense enough that a small cake could fuel a man through a full day of physical labor in freezing conditions. One early account noted that there was no assignable limit to how long properly made pemmican could keep, as long as the bags stayed dry. The Comanche traded pemmican widely through a network that stretched across the southern plains. They exchanged it with agricultural tribes like the Wichita and Caddo to the east for pumpkin seeds, maize, honey, and tobacco. They bartered with Pueblo groups to the west for cloth and manufactured goods. Because of their skills as traders and their control of the buffalo economy, the Comanche dominated the commerce of the entire southern plains, acting as middlemen between settled agricultural peoples and other nomadic groups. It was portable enough for hunters to carry in belt pouches during winter expeditions, and substantial enough to serve as a family's primary food source when blizzards kept everyone inside the lodge for days at a stretch. The women who spent the weeks before winter processing buffalo meat and rendering fat understood something clearly. The margin between surviving the cold months and starving through them was measured in pounds of stored protein and calories. They prepared for winter the way a besieged city prepares for a prolonged siege. Every hide scraped, every strip of meat dried, every bag of pemmican sealed with tallow was another week of survival banked against the months ahead. Clothing was the third pillar, and again, the buffalo was the foundation. Comanche men wore buckskin breechcloths and shirts during the warmer months. Women wore buckskin shirts and long, decorated fringed skirts. But when winter set in, both men and women added heavy robes made from buffalo hides with the fur turned inward against the skin, creating a layer of insulation that trapped body heat the way the Tipi's inner lining trapped fire heat. Leggings of heavy buckskin covered the legs from hip to ankle. The moccasins were craftsmanship of a different order. Unlike the soft-soled footwear of many neighboring tribes, Comanche moccasins used the toughest section of buffalo hide for their soles, creating a shoe that could handle frozen ground, sharp rocks, and months of continuous wear. The Comanche rubbed animal grease into the leather until the moccasins were functionally waterproof, a small detail with enormous consequences when you're walking through snow and ice for 5 months. Heel fringes on the back dragged behind the wearer, erasing tracks in dust and dirt. And Comanche men claimed they could identify any person they knew simply by examining the sole pattern, heel fringe, and toe design of a moccasin print left in the snow. And beneath all of this sat the horses. The Comanche's bond with horses went deeper than any other tribe on the continent. Boys learned to ride before they turned 6. Warriors trained their mounts for specific roles: hunting horses, war horses, racing horses, and a favorite animal might serve all 3 functions. A mounted Comanche warrior could hang beneath a galloping horse, shielded by the animal's body, and fire arrows from under its neck at a full run. In winter, horses were more than transportation. They were wealth, insurance, and the mechanism that connected one season's survival to the next. An average Comanche family maintained a herd of around 35 horses and mules, 5 to 6 times more than basic needs required. Across the entire nation, surplus herds numbered between 90,000 and 120,000 animals. Horses served as the primary currency of Comancheria. A man's social standing rose and fell with the size of his herd. Horses were traded for guns, ammunition, metal tools, and blankets. They were raided from Spanish settlements, Mexican ranches, and rival tribes. They were the living wealth of a people who carried no gold and built no banks. Through the winter months, the horse herds grazed the sheltered canyon bottoms alongside the camps, feeding on cured grass and sheltering behind the same walls that protected the people. The Comanche rotated grazing areas carefully, moving herds between different stretches of canyon floor to prevent any single area from being overgrazed. Favorite war horses and hunting horses were often kept close to the lodges, sometimes fed cottonwood bark when grass ran thin, because losing a trained mount was losing years of investment. Keeping the herds alive through winter was as critical as keeping the families alive, because without horses, the spring buffalo hunt couldn't happen. And without the spring hunt, the next winter's pemmican stores would never be filled. The cycle was annual, and it had no room for a broken link. This detail, the connection between winter horse care and the following winter's food supply, was a warning sign the Comanche couldn't afford to miss. Every element of the system depended on every other element. Shelter depended on buffalo hides. Food depended on buffalo meat. Hunting depended on horses. Horses depended on grass. And grass depended on the land staying open, unplowed, and ungrazed by anything except buffalo and Comanche ponies. By the mid-1800s, that balance was already fracturing. White buffalo hunters had moved onto the plains in force, killing bison at an industrial pace for their hides alone, leaving carcasses to rot across the grassland. The Comanche's own massive horse herds were competing with the dwindling bison for forage and water. Diseases carried by European settlers, smallpox and cholera especially, had torn through the Comanche population. By the 1870s, the nation that had once numbered as many as 40,000 people had been reduced to roughly 7,000. But the final blow was precise, deliberate, and aimed directly at the winter system. In the fall of 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie and the 4th United States Cavalry rode onto the southern plains as part of the Red River War, a coordinated 5-pronged military campaign designed to force the last free Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne bands onto reservations in Indian Territory. Mackenzie commanded the southern column, driving north into the heart of Comancheria. On the morning of September 28th, guided by Tonkawa scouts, Mackenzie reached the rim of Palo Duro Canyon and looked down. Below him, stretching for miles along the canyon floor, sat the winter camp. Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne, lodges in rows, thousands of horses grazing. Stored pemmican and dried meat packed and ready. Everything these bands needed to survive the coming winter was spread out beneath those 800-foot walls. Mackenzie's cavalry found a trail down the canyon wall and descended at dawn. The Comanche war leader Red Warbenet spotted the soldiers and raised the alarm, giving the warriors time to mount a defense while women and children escaped up side canyons and scattered onto the plains above. The fighting killed only a handful of warriors on each side, but Mackenzie wasn't there to win a battle. He was there to destroy a system. His troops burned the lodges, hundreds of them. They seized every store of dried food they could find. And then Mackenzie ordered his men to drive the captured horse herd, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 animals, 20 miles south into Tule Canyon. His Tonkawa scouts selected a few horses for themselves. The rest were driven up a long draw and shot by cavalrymen, the bones bleached in the canyon for years. The Southern Plains' finest horsemen were now on foot, without shelter, without stored food, heading into winter on the open caprock. And that's not something I'm making up. Mackenzie understood the winter system. His commanding officer, General William Tecumseh Sherman, the same Sherman who burned his way across Georgia during the Civil War, had applied his theory of attacking the enemy's commissary to the Indian campaigns. Destroy the ability to feed, shelter, and move, and you destroy the ability to resist. Without horses, the Comanche couldn't hunt. Without lodges, they couldn't shelter from the cold. Without pemmican stores, they couldn't wait out the blizzards. The system that had sustained them for 150 years had been dismantled in a single morning. Some bands straggled back to the Fort Sill Reservation in Oklahoma by November, starving and frostbitten, arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others refused to surrender and held out through the winter on the open caprock, hunting small game on foot where they had once run buffalo from horseback, sheltering in ravines and behind rock outcroppings where a Tipi village had once stood. The Kiowa leader Lone Wolf's band didn't come in until February of 1875, after months of exposure on the winter plains without adequate food or shelter. Quanah Parker, the war chief whose mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, had been the most famous white captive ever taken and raised among the Comanche, led one of the last free bands. In the spring of 1875, he walked his people 200 miles east to Fort Sill and surrendered. The Comanche survived the deadliest prairie winters not through raw toughness or luck. They survived because they engineered an interlocking system where geography, portable architecture, animal husbandry, food science, and material craft all reinforced each other. Every component depended on every other component, and every component came from the same grassland ecosystem that tried to kill them 5 months out of every year. The canyon walls still stand at Palo Duro. The river still runs along its floor. Juniper trees still line the slopes, but the rows of teepees are gone, the horse herds are gone, and the knowledge of how to turn 800 feet of rock into a winter fortress lives now in language, in oral history, and in the records of the people who took it apart. The Comanche Nation is headquartered today in Lawton, Oklahoma, a federally recognized tribe that carries forward a culture built on the open plains and tested against the worst those plains could deliver. What survived wasn't the canyon camps or the pemmican or the buffalo hide tipis. What survived was the knowledge that it was possible, carried in the Comanche language, which is still spoken today, and in the oral histories passed through families who remember exactly what their ancestors built and exactly how it was taken apart. A people once looked at -20 and open sky and flat, treeless grassland stretching to the horizon in every direction, and they didn't retreat to the mountains or the forests. They studied the landscape, found its hidden shelters, learned its rhythms, and built a way to live inside it that worked for 150 years. If you want to see how another civilization turned a brutal landscape into a strategic advantage, that video is on screen now.